As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I met Athena Dixon at the 2017 Hippocamp Literary Conference. Soon after, we joined a writing collective where we got to know each other better, and I got to watch her career blossom. I've had the pleasure of reading her Pushcart Prize-winning poetry and essays and cheering her on as she published her essay collections, The Incredible Shrinking Woman and The Loneliness Files, which has received wide acclaim and been reviewed in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Publishers Weekly, to name a few. Since recording this episode, she has been hired as the acquisitions editor for Split Lip Press. To learn more about all of Athena's awards, accolades, and accomplishments, please see the show notes for this episode. During our conversation, we explored the multiple facets of loneliness, how to decide what work is for you and what's for the public, and how to create your own definition of success. As you prepare for this episode, I have a few questions for you. How do you define loneliness? How did the pandemic impact the way you defined it and how you experienced it? What does success look like for you? And what's one positive association you have with being alone? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen to this episode. And now let's get to my conversation with Athena Dixon. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. Well, hello, Athena. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I am so glad that you're here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you have been in the middle of a book launch for The Loneliness Files. I got this here. I have like some little tabbed marks because I just love all of your writing. I've been a huge fan for a long time. And so every time I get one of your books, the way I love your books is by writing in them. So I'm underlining, I'm starring, I'm doing all of that stuff because to me, that's love.
It is. I do the same thing.
So because you just launched a book, what would you like us to know about The Loneliness Files? And what would you like us to know about you?
I think The Loneliness Files is just, for me, and I hope for the audience, like a series of explorations, a series of conversations, both internally and externally, about how we've come to be in these very lonely places in our lives and how we can make a little bit of a solution about loneliness, but also it has its usefulness as well. And then about me, I guess it's that I'm an insanely curious person who gets really hyperfixated on things about the human experience. And I hope that my writing is a way of kind of puzzling out those feelings and those emotions and that other people can kind of find connection to it. And that alone makes me feel like I've accomplished something in my work.
Well, I can definitely say that I have seen the curiosity on the page, and you make me more curious about the experience of loneliness. It's been an issue for a long time for a lot of people, and I think COVID really brought it home. And so what was the inspiration for you? You talk about it a little bit in this book, but what would you like us to know?
I guess the biggest thing is that the book wasn't necessarily meant to be a book at the offset. What happened is that I went from working in this office 5 days a week to being alone in a 2-bedroom apartment with no partner, no pet, no family in the city. And so what I thought would be 2 weeks of just like relaxation and resetting turned into roughly 3 years of me working from home.
Yeah.
And so I got really, really, really lonely in a way that I wasn't lonely before. I thought that because I had this sense of independence that I was okay. And so I got really hyperfixated on video game walkthroughs and listening to them during my day because I could hear like the lull of conversation and voices starting and stopping. And that eventually led me to watching videos about mysterious disappearances and mysterious deaths. And I got really, really into them and came across the story of Joyce Carol Vincent, and I saw myself in her. And so because I saw myself in her and there was this curiosity and this fear about her, I decided I was going to start writing about my own feelings. And that eventually, about 8 essays in, morphed into thinking I was writing a book about loneliness and disconnection.
Yeah, and that first essay, I will not stop thinking about that. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about Joyce and what you learned about her? Because I think that this is such a great hook for what you write about in this book and all of the essays that you've created.
So Joyce Carol Vincent was a British woman. She was, at the time of her passing, 38. She was kind of like everything you expect people to be in the world. She had corporate jobs. She had, I believe, 4 sisters. She had a fiance at one point. She was very beautiful. She was very connected to the world. But at some point in about 2003, she kind of just let go of her life. And
Mm.
she kind of isolated apartment above a shopping center. And around Christmas time in 2003, she passed away. They did not find her body until 2006. And when they found her, she was still in front of the television. The television was still on, her utilities were still on. There were Christmas gifts beside her, but she had died.
Yeah.
And so then this story kind of unfolds of like, how does a person disappear for 3 years who's very much connected to the world and nobody knows that she's gone? And it was kind of like this exploration into how a person can like slip through the cracks of society. And she was like the poster child for this for me.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that hit me so hard was how could someone not know? For 3 years, no one questions it at all?
Yeah, they said that well, they think one of her neighbors knocked because our television was a little loud, but she didn't answer, so they let it go. The smell of her decomposition. There was like a mall below her apartment, so they thought that it was like the dumpsters. So like all these little clues that would put people into the mindset of like something's not right, kind of just fell by the wayside. And it wasn't until all of the social programs that kept her rent paid and her utilities on could no longer like exist around her absence that people realized we have to go evict her. And that's how they found her. They went to go evict her from her apartment and then they found her body.
Yeah, that is just bananas to me that that's what happened. And what I love about this book is that you use these very public things that happen as a way to draw inward. And I've been really sitting with what that was like for you in COVID to be just in an apartment by yourself, sitting there with everything being mediated by a screen
Yeah.
and while living in a big city. When we talk about loneliness, there's isolation, and that's one form of loneliness, but there's another form of loneliness where you are in a huge group of people and you feel alone. And there's a way that living in a big city, as you do, I would imagine it's a little bit of both. Did you have that experience?
I think so. Those 3 years during COVID, which is one of the lenses that the book gets told through, was that I live in this apartment building, and it's a small apartment building by city standards. I think there's 36 apartments in my building. And I realized as COVID kind of went on, I don't know my neighbors' names. I may know their last name because it's on the mailboxes downstairs. We may have passed each other in the elevator on the stairs, but I know nothing about these people, but I live in the center of them. I live in the city with 1.5 million people, but outside of like passing like hellos and like the post office or the grocery store, there's no connection. Like, and you could be surrounded by all these millions of people and there's nothing. And
Yeah.
then individually, I'm isolated because I'm so far away from my family and I'm so now far away from my friends that it was just like this concentric circle of isolation with the bigger city and then the individual family unit and then the individual apartment. And it was just really hard to escape from.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely relentless. And I just keep sitting with that relentlessness and how hard that can be. And yet, you were able to take this experience and turn it into a book and really look at all of it, these different facets of loneliness. And what was interesting for me when I was reading this is that you speak about your individual experience and you do this so well. And I mean, you're a poet in addition to writing all of this prose, and it shows in this book. But you write about this in a way that is so intimate, it feels like you're writing it to me. And there are some things that you write about that are so specific that it speaks directly to my experience, even though you and I have had very different experiences in the world. And When you were writing this book, did you know that you were doing that? Or have you heard this before?
I'm starting to hear it a little bit more because people are starting to come to me and say that they found things that resonated with them and that they felt like in some way I was giving voice to their experiences. But I think in some ways I approach the page, whatever I write, especially prose, with this idea of I know what it's like to feel like my experiences or my voice are not loud enough or valid enough or valuable enough that whatever I write, I want to find a way to give voice and platform to people who may feel the same. And so I try at the offset, at least, to make my experiences very personal because I'm writing personal memoir, but also a little bit universal enough that people can kind of step into my skin and kind of see their own experiences. So it's something that I think about, but when I'm actually in the act of writing, I'm just trying to get the experience out onto the page in a way that sonically works, in a way that emotionally works, in a way that creatively works. And I think that because I'm willing to be honest and I'm willing to be transparent, not to the point of
Mm-hmm.
harming myself, but transparent enough where people feel comfortable to kind of link their own experiences with it. I think that's why it resonates with people, because I think that they realize that there's not a performance of it. It's like
Mm-hmm.
this is experience and I'm not tailor making it to fit a particular genre. I'm not tailor making it to manipulate you in any way. It's just like this is what this feels like. And I hope that if you felt this the same way, that we can kind of come into community together.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about this concept of honesty, like writing honestly about your experience. And yet you write honestly and vulnerably, but you don't there's a boundary there, right? There's the part that is for the world and there's a part that is just for you in all of your experiences. How do you manage that? Because I think that's a huge issue for a lot of writers, and especially we live in this very confessional world. Social media is like, tell us everything. And yet, sharing everything isn't necessarily in service to you or to anyone else.
I think the first thing I always do when I get ready to write something, especially something that's really personal, is I start to think about a few things. One is I really ask myself, is this something for public consumption? But there are certain experiences that I write about, and I've joked about this over the last couple of weeks of my book tour, that I have this folder called Good Morning Heartache, where I just write stuff that I need to get out of my body and my
Mm-hmm.
brain, but I don't want to put it into the world because either it's just mean spirited or it's hurtful or it's harmful to me or other people, or there's something unresolved about that situation that I'm not ready to kind of like put in the world. Because once you put it into the world, you can't control how people analyze it. You
Yeah.
can't control judgment of it. You can't control how long you're going to be asked about it. You can't control anything. It's in the world. It doesn't belong to you anymore. And so I always have to ask myself tough questions like, yeah, this could creatively be really, really good, but what's the harm? Like, what's the damage
Yes.
putting this into the world? And if I'm sitting at a conference or I'm doing an interview or somebody emails me, is it going to cause me harm by having to respond to that or to answer a question? And if I can say yes, then it's not time to put that into the world. But I will say there are times that I've circled back to stuff that I thought I wasn't ready to write about, but there was years like between
Mm-hmm.
experience and me putting it in that folder and me actually writing about it. But I think I also approach writing the way kind of I approach social media. Like my social media, I feel like I am very honest. It's not always pretty, but there's nothing that I put on my social media, despite sometimes I might be crying or I might be upset. Like there's nothing that I put on my social media that I'm not willing to talk to somebody about, because I think that it's important as a writer to be, again, transparent with the highs and the lows, just as I think you owe it to your readers as a writer to be transparent about the highs and the lows, but also to not do harm to yourself. And I think readers can tell when you're being salacious for the sake of being salacious. And I'm not willing to sacrifice those things about myself, but I'm also not willing to hide very real experiences in order to paint a picture of a person who doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and I love that you do that, and I think it's so important. And when it comes to my social media account, and in some ways, my newsletter and everything that I do, there's this aspect of if I wouldn't shout it in Walmart, or maybe shout it to a friend in Walmart. Let's say
Yeah.
that, like maybe not to everybody, but if I wouldn't do that, maybe it's not ready for the world because of the very things that you talked about. The fact that once it's out there, it doesn't belong to you. And sometimes when it comes to really difficult material, people don't know what to do with it.
Right.
you're handing them something that they don't know what to do with. And some of the things you talk about in this book, like you talk about feeling suicidal, wearing a mask where there's like this illusion of this perfect person, the perfect friend, the perfect whatever you need me to be, and yet the pain behind it. And you share this in such a way that I feel it, and yet I don't feel burdened by it.
I think part of it is like a part of this ongoing path I'm on as a writer, because I was doing a talk last weekend, and one of the things that came up was like, do you kind of regret things that you've written in the past? And I said that I didn't regret anything that I wrote in the past. What it was is that I wish that I would have given more creative care to that work, less of a diary entry. So I think I'm starting to refine a skill set that allows me to kind of be open and transparent, but also doesn't come across too just raw. Like I think rawness, especially in personal memoir and essay, gets conflated a lot with like honesty. It's almost like people are like brutally honest. I'm like, yeah, but the brutal part is the part that you're focusing on. I'm like, the honesty can come without that brutality. And so it's kind of always my goal is like, I want to be honest, but I don't want to be brutal to myself. I don't want to be brutal to other people because I cannot control that once it's out into the world. And I don't want that kind of creative karma on myself or anybody else.
Yeah, and I think that's an evolutionary process for all of us. What's part of your skill set? You said you've been developing this skill set over time. What would you say are the parts of that skill set?
I think I'm learning to kind of like rein in the things that I feel. I think in my first book versus my second book, my first book, I jokingly now call my selfish book because it was just like, I feel like nobody's ever listened to me before. So I'm just going to scream onto the page and let the chips fall where they may. This time for this book, now 3 years later, I feel like I've learned to rein in those emotions and to be able to pack them a little bit more neatly without sacrificing the experience. It's almost like figuring out how like to harness the wind in a way. So my skill set is becoming very much like how do I hone in onto individual lines, individual images, individual emotions, and find the correct vessel to put that story into. Because I think
Mm.
I was thinking that the vessel was just the page. That's like the foundation, but like what's the vessel of the story? And I'd never thought about that in that first book. I was just like, it's on the page and it's done. So now I'm like, what's the vessel of the story? What's the emotional movement of the story? What am I hoping to move towards? Even if there's no resolution, like what am I moving toward? Like it can't
Hmm.
just be here's the experience. I'm done. Like there has to be some kind of movement. So I think now I'm getting better at figuring out that vessel and that movement, resolutions or lack of resolutions. So I used to be really married to the idea that there had to be a resolution, and there doesn't.
Yeah, and there does, and I agree with you. There doesn't, because sometimes to try to create a resolution is to lie about the experience, right? Because not everything does get resolved. When you were talking about this new way of looking at your work and what happened in your first book, the first essay that came to mind, which is an essay that I absolutely love, is The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And it comes to mind just because you wrote it so fast, and then it got published by Roxane Gay. And I wonder, as you're thinking about the skill set and the vessel of the story and all of those things, does that essay come to mind, or does something else?
Think that essay, if I go back to it, I think that I would have expanded it a little bit. I think I would have given it some more scenes. I think that I was like, while I think there's depth to that essay, I think that it's still fairly surface level. Like, and I think it was good enough to get published, obviously, but I think that I could have delved a little bit deeper into some of those images and some of those fears and those insecurities in a way that would have brought a bigger audience to it, because I wasn't thinking externally at all during that essay. Like I think for anybody who probably has never heard me talk about this essay, I wrote it on the plane on my phone because I was angry, really angry at the woman in front of me on the plane. And that was my way of not saying anything to her. But I think had I given that essay more time, I would have been able to find better entry points for my readers. I think that it would have probably been a couple thousand words longer. And I think that it would have gave a fuller picture of me as a person. And I think I would have had a little bit more emotional depth as a narrator in that essay had I thought about it a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, and so what I hear is it's a matter of both time and applying craft, right?
Yeah.
So it's a mixture of those two things, because you need the time to figure out what was really going on, what is my angle here? What role do I want to play? But then also thinking about those sentence level issues, the structure. And it is, I'm going to link this in the show notes because it is still a beautiful essay and it's a powerful essay. And I've actually used it with some of my clients to show them what good writing looks like and what focused writing looks like, because even though there's a way that you could write that better or differently, it's still a really powerful essay. And I think it's the sharpness of the experience and the directness of it that to me is the power and what I was taking away from that. So you have worked very hard for a very long time to hone your craft in a variety of different ways and to write incredible books. And another thing that you've really talked about over the years is what success is and what it looks like to you. And over this little bit of time since your book came out, you've been mentioned in the New York Times. You've been
Yes.
reviewed in the Washington Post. You have done all of these different things. How is that impacting your views of success for yourself?
I think that my views of what I think my personal writing success looks like is the same. I think I'm just taking these opportunities that are popping up right now because of the current book as tools to help me get to some of my goals that I haven't met on that original list. So like one of the things that I would deem writing success for me is to finally land an agent. And I'm hoping that now that I can say, hey, by the way, my book was in the Washington Post and the New York Times and it got a Kirkus review. Like, you want to represent me as a client. And so I'm hoping that I can use these experiences that were never part of my writing success bingo card. Like New York Times and Washington Post never crossed my mind. Using those things as tools to get what I really want. So being able to transition out of my day job by now being able to have some conversations with people that are interested in talking to me now, and being able to approach an agent and say, hey, I have a little bit of a spotlight right now. Can you please look at the thing that I'm currently working on? So it's really been a matter of sticking to my actual writing goals and my success plan and using those things that I didn't expect as a way to get closer to those goals. Because after kind of like all this spotlight from the book kind of wanes, like I still know that the things that I want in my writing success haven't changed in terms of like, I don't think that I'm ever going to pitch a big five. I don't
Mm.
think that I would be a full-time writer. Like those aren't things that I have on my list. And so I just want to use these opportunities to get myself closer to those opportunities. And I would say the same thing for somebody who may end up in a similar position. And like, doesn't mean that your list can't change. It can't mean that your idea of your success can't change. But if there's such a big swing, like you have to stop and ask yourself, what if I get everything that this swing is giving me? Am I going to be happy? Am I going to be content? Am I going to be able to maintain this? Like sophomore book, jinx, third book, like you might have like the highest of highs, and then you sign the next book, and then New York Times is like, who? There's no guarantee that you can stay on that pendulum. So if you swing back to the middle, like what still exists in that middle? You want the really, really good stuff, but you also want to be realistic about what you can maintain and what you can be comfortable with as a person.
Absolutely. And one thing that you said that really resonates with me is you said, I don't want to be a full time writer. And honestly, I don't want to be a full time writer either. I have very specific reasons, which I can share in a moment. But I'm curious why you say you don't want to be a full time writer when you got all this writing success coming at you.
Practically, and I'll say this, like practically, I need a steady paycheck. I'm a single person who lives very far from her family. I don't come from generational wealth. My parents are retirement age. My sister is 12 years younger. My income is my income. And if I don't have steady income from whatever source I have steady income from, it impacts my day-to-day life, where
Mhm.
I can live, what I can eat, what I can drive, insurance, like those things are very important to me because right now in my mid 40s, the foreseeable future, I'm it. Like, so I have to be able to plan to take care of myself. So practically it's money. Also, I love writing in a way, and I know myself well enough to know that if I spend the entirety of my working life doing writing and like full time, I'm going to burn myself out. I'm going to find some level of resentment. I'm not going to enjoy it as much because it becomes a chore. Like if my livelihood is directly tied to how many books I can sell or how big of an advance I can get and how I can earn out that advance, I know that I'm not going to be happy because it becomes all business and not creativity. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think writing, especially if you're writing for publication and you're writing books, there's two different sides. And I think sometimes people say you write the book and then okay, like no, there's a whole business side that doesn't care about how good your book is. I'm like, and I don't want to live in the business side of writing. And also, I have other interests. Like, I genuinely enjoy reading other people's books and giving comments. And I genuinely enjoy, although I get very nervous, doing speaking engagements. And so I like to have the ability to move within creative spaces without being married to one and burning myself out on that particular thing.
That's a lot of it for me is I don't want my creativity to be married to the business. I say thank you every single day that I get to do what I do, even though I scrap and I hustle a lot to make this work. But I love that I get to do different things. I love teaching, I love editing people's work, and I love knowing that those things are separate from my creativity. Right? I can go off and write, and yeah, if I get something published and I get a check from it, great. But
Yeah.
I can write for the joy of writing, and I can write for the truth of whatever the story is. And yeah, it's important to think about audience at a certain point. But I think when you get really married to the business, it's all about the external audience.
Yeah.
And I think that it works for some writers to be able to do that, but I think it can just steal your joy.
Yeah. I think too, it's sometimes I might even like boil down to genre because I can't imagine as a creative nonfiction writer or an essayist who's writing very personal stuff if my entire livelihood was dependent on mining myself and my brain and my experiences to sell books at a clip that will allow me to have a comfortable life. Like there would be so much personal damage for me. And then at some point out of like experiences that you have a distance to, that that you're writing in the moment, and that is a slippery slope because then you become a data miner. You're not even living
Mm-hmm.
a full life. You're writing for content. And I mentioned in a course group of people I was talking to last week, and it's like the curse of the influencer, that content becomes more important than living. I'm like, I never
Yes.
want to be in a situation where I'm concerned about the content more than I am the lived experience. And so for me, it wouldn't work.
Amen to that. And I think about that with like social media as just an example. Like I am a person who I have social media accounts. I'm working on Instagram and doing different things that are in alignment with what I do.
Yeah.
But and I have someone who helps me, and I'm very transparent about that because I think that's okay.
Yeah.
But I am very clear about the fact that I do not walk around with my phone trying to record everything I do. There's plenty of my life that is not recorded and will always be that way. And I feel good about that
Yeah.
because I can't live in the moment if I'm constantly doing that data mining and going like, oh, this is a perfect sunset for Instagram or wherever. It's like you're
And
not
even
in the moment.
yeah, like and even so, like I say that I call myself sometimes a magpie because I always have like scraps of things and screenshots and little things written down in notes and things. But even with that, I'm like, even in those moments where I'm like, this might be something useful for later, I always am very cognizant of the idea that there has to be some distance because if you're writing it in the moment, I think there's so much potential for manipulation that you can tailor the experience to what you're writing versus you writing what actually happened. And so, like, I never want to be in a situation where I'm writing too closely to the thing that I've lived because it's for me, because I'm not a person who writes articles or hot takes, like, can never do that. I don't want to write too closely to the experience because I don't have any kind of space to puzzle out how it may connect to other things in my life and what is the kernel of curiosity that's driving me towards this other than this flash of something in a moment. Doesn't mean that I don't catalog it, but I'm not actively going out to create based on it because it's just not enough distance for me.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. And I taught this course for Jane Friedman recently on the psychology of memoir. And we talked a lot about memory. And one thing that happens with memory is that you take in all of these experiences and then you record them in your brain. But the more you rehearse certain parts, the more that becomes the memory. And so if you're spending a lot of time not just recording, like I think it's great to journal and it's great to get all of these things down when they're fresh, if it's something powerful for you. But when you start trying to manipulate it for an
Mhm.
audience, you actually take away the capacity to make those connections because you solidify certain parts of that memory and you can actually erase or
Mhm.
minimize other parts because that's how the brain works. It takes those things away because you've identified them as not important.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's like passion versus performance again. Like you can tell when something is because you're being led somewhere very specific, because you're being shown a very specific face or a very specific whatever it may be, versus somebody being just so passionate and curious about something that they're willing to share it with you. Like, and I think that because we exist in a world, and I say this all with the person who's very, very much connected to social media and online life, but I think that there's this weird tipping point that we've like messed up where we're thinking we're so used to the curated lives and we're so used to the highlight reels and we're so used to like content creation and now influencer being a real job, a real career, that we forget like the social part of social media, and we forget that what it was at its onset was like just a way of connecting with the community versus branding or selling or curating this perfect facade. Like, and all those things have its plate, they have places, like you need like organized structures for things, but I think that that can't be the only way that people engage with it. And so at least on my end, I try to do my best to have a mix of like, hey, I got to promote this thing. So here's the performance part, but also here's the passion part that I'm ranting about a random book in my stories today. So like, I think there needs to be a balance, and I'm hoping that that becomes more of the norm as we go on.
Absolutely, because I do think that when you don't have it, it makes it so performative, and also it enhances your sense of loneliness because you aren't engaging with other people. It's like one more screen that you are putting stuff out there, and I think there's two ways that it can make you lonely. Is one, if you put things out there and you don't get the likes or the comments or all the things, the feedback,
Yeah.
that can make it feel like that can enforce reinforce this idea that, oh, maybe I don't matter, maybe what I have to say doesn't matter. But then there's this idea that if you're always just performing, you're never authentic.
Yeah. It's very much digital loneliness. And I think that because we are so hyper connected and we have access to each other so often and pretty much 24/7, is that people assume that all connection that exists on social media is, I don't want to say good connection, but it's valuable or valid connection. And it's easy, like you like, I don't think people pay attention because it's so ingrained in our everyday lives and how easy it is to scroll and double tap or
Mm-hmm.
scroll, hit the like button or scroll and hit retweet without actively reading the caption or looking at the real, like really ingesting and paying attention to what people are putting into the world, because it's like just muscle memory at this point. And so there's a loneliness and being that detached from yourself and detached from others, that even though you're touching, but there's a disconnection here. There's like, it's like a buffer, and it's just muscle memory at this point. And like, so I don't, I'm like, I will say, I'm like, I'm not above the muscle memory at all. I'm more on Facebook than I am anywhere else. I'm a lot muscle memory on Twitter. Twitter is just me reposting stuff that people tag me in mainly. But Instagram is where I make a conscious effort to try to be engaged because it's where I feel most comfortable. And so I make it a point to slow down and to read captions and to look at people's stories and to interact or to DM people in a way that's not just, oh, I saw your post, acknowledged, and then move on to the next. But I think it's just muscle memory that we have to fight against at some point.
Absolutely, because if we don't, what are we going to have left? A bunch of screens and nothing, and I think especially men, there's this huge epidemic of men who have no friends, and I think this is happening for women too, where our worlds are becoming smaller and smaller, that we don't have strong connections because so much is mediated by screens and we spend so much more time alone. I mean, I work from home all the time and I have to actively engage with other people and make concerted efforts to have those relationships because I could just be in my house and petting my cats all day if I wanted to. And so in your book, you look at these different things. And so there's ways that you looked at other people's loneliness. You looked at your own experiences of loneliness and how, COVID kind of forced loneliness on you. But there's something that we have in common that I'd want to talk about. And that is your experience in the sensory deprivation tank, which is your intentional going into a space of isolation.
Yeah. I, oddly enough, stumbled across that on Groupon. I was heavy into ordering stuff from Groupon. It's where I learned how to shoot because I bought a coupon on Groupon and then I found the sensory deprivation tank. And for me, it was a matter of I felt like my brain is always on. Like I barely sleep. Like I barely sleep. It's because my brain is forever just going on. I'm thinking of things I have to do or things I haven't responded to, or the minute my eyes open, I'm just off and running. And so when I came across the sensory deprivation tank, I was like, the easiest thing I can do is lock myself in this tank for 90 minutes. And my phone's not around. There's no sound, there's no light, there's nothing. It's just me in some water floating in the dark for 90 minutes. And that's going to help me reset. And the first float tank, absolutely did not work. I wasn't afraid. Like, I think some people I've talked to about the deprivation tanks are like, how do you float in the dark for 90 minutes? I'm like, that's not the fear. The fear was missing out on my life outside of the tank and what notifications I'm missing and what phone calls I may be missing, opportunities. Like, then it was also this addiction with like, I need to post this. I have to show people that I'm doing this cool thing. And it took multiple trips to the deprivation tank before I successfully like disconnected. But it took me buying a monthly membership to the float tank center before I could do it. I didn't realize how hard it would be to stop myself from being connected to everything in the world. It took a lot to do.
Oh my gosh, it takes so much effort to do that. And I have had floats where it was like this blissful, amazing experience of like, just relaxing. And
Yeah.
then other times where, like you, my mind's like, all the stuff I should be doing out in the world. But my greatest fear in the sensory deprivation tank is getting that salt in my eyes.
I've done it once. I did the pod and then I also did the room size. I write about the room size experience in the book, but the first one I did was the pod. And so it was like barely like I could just stretch my arms and touch the sides. And they had like on the hook on the inside, when you close, there was like a little spray bottle and a towel. And I didn't think about like my hands being salty when I'm trying to get these things and just like spreading salt in my eyes was not pleasant at all. I miss doing them. I think I'm better prepared for them now because I know that the tank, I think when I went into the tank experience, I was thinking that the tank itself was going to do magic. And I was just going to get in there and turn off the lights and the music and just disconnect. I think now I'm better prepared to know that it's like an internal thing. And I'm better prepared at disconnecting my body in a way that I wasn't before, because now I'm actively realizing like how connected I always am. Like I think before I was just thinking, oh, your body will shut down. It's like going to sleep, and it's not. I've never fallen asleep in the float tank, but I took a friend and he did the very first time. He slept like the entire 90 minutes in the float tank.
I am very impressed by this person.
I'm jealous because like, why can't I do that? I will say that the scary, like the one that I read about in the book was scary because I think that I wasn't fully prepared for my own thought. That level, like when it's just pitch dark and there's no sound and it's just you and your brain, there is something like you can't contribute. There's no external stimuli where you can distract yourself with a notification or a TV or a song. Like it's just you and your brain in the dark. And I think that was the first time where I was like, I can't control my thoughts in the way that I thought that I could. Like I can control them on the paper, but like just in the world, no, I can't.
Yeah, and I think that, because a lot of people who are going to listen to this podcast are trauma survivors, and they may think, oh, I'm going to go into the sensory deprivation tank. And what I would say is, don't do that without a little preparation for the very reason that you're talking about. It's the same thing with having a long vacation. it can sound wonderful, but if you have a long time where you have a lot of time to yourself, your brain can be a bad neighborhood and you can have so many dark thoughts. And if you don't have ways to get yourself out of them, it's not going to be supportive to you.
Yeah, it's not like physically lovely, like just floating and not touching anything for people who are going in strictly for just like their body to have a reset where they don't have to touch or like their joints are really bad. Perfect. Mind, you really have to be prepared because it's like I write in the book about the Gansfeld effect, about like when you cut off your other senses, your brain tries to fill in the neural noise. And for me, part of that was like there was this experience that I had where my eyes were closed and there was such fear because I felt like I couldn't stop seeing. Like every time I thought that, my brain was kind of like, okay, my eyes are closed, I'm not seeing anything. And like just images and random memories would pop up. And it really is like this, at some levels, can be like this psychedelic experience. And so you have to be really prepared to either deal with it while you're in there, have some kind of aftercare when you get out, or have a plan that you can like decompress from the decompression, because it really is, your mind is just free.
Yeah, and a free mind can be a great thing and it can be a terrible thing. And one thing they talk about with that sense of what happens to your mind is that your mind is constantly on. And what I'm curious about is this idea of being on and having the brain be on. How does that intersect with loneliness? You know, because you often think about loneliness, or at least a word that comes to my mind is absence. But I'm wondering what you learned through the process of writing this or the work you're doing. How does all of that come together?
I think for me, what ended up happening with my brain always being on is part of the way that my brain functions is always in a sense of hyper independence. And so I'm a person who's always like, there's nothing that anyone can do for me that I can't do for myself. And so my brain exists in this sense of hyper independence, which creates this like level of isolation, this level of loneliness, because I don't reach out to people to do things for me or to help me with something or to help me puzzle through something or to just let me vent. So I cut myself off because my brain is always like, no, you're fine, you're capable, you can do this. I'm like, yes, I am, but I also don't have to do this alone. I also don't have to isolate. And so writing the book really for the first time was me confronting my hyper independence. Like it made me say,
Mm.
why did you move almost 400 miles away by yourself with no apartment to a major American city? Like, why do you only go home once a year?
Mm.
Why, especially when you know that like you're becoming like this elder and your family, your mom and dad and your aunts and uncles are getting older and now passing away. Like, why are you making that decision? Why are you living in this place by yourself and not going out more, reaching out to people? Like these things you see as like, I'm a modern American woman living in the city and I'm successful, is really like hiding stuff that you're afraid to confront.
Mm.
Part of that was me being afraid of dying alone and not being good enough to have a partner, and still healing from all the trauma of the years that brought me to Philadelphia in the first place. And it was the first time where I had to really sit down and say, there's an illusion that you live under.
Yeah.
And some of it is useful for you, but a lot of it is just weighing you down. And you have to figure out what's useful about this isolation and what's not, and then start making steps towards fixing the stuff or letting go of the stuff that's not useful to you.
How has the reception of this book influenced this conversation you're having with yourself around what you're confronting and what this book has helped you recognize?
I think it's the reception has kind of surprised me in some ways. And I say surprised me because there's been some criticism of the book where some people have felt that it was too sad or too
Hmm.
depressing. And I'm like, it's called the Loneliness Files. I don't really know what to tell you. But what it made me realize is like, I think that those responses are people who are just stepping onto the path that I'm currently walking.
What is the best piece of writing advice that you've received that you love to pass on to others?
I always go back to what Beth Wen told me in my V.O.N.A memoir pod back in 2018. I was very much afraid of not being important enough or having an interesting enough story to be a person who wrote memoir and personal essay. And I kind of said as much in that group. And she stopped me and said, what would it mean to you to have had a person with your voice writing when you were growing? And I had never thought about it like that, because all I could see was I'm just this regular boring person, and I don't have like these experiences that are loud or boisterous. But that made me realize like there are people who need to hear what you write in the way that you write it, as quiet or as loud as it could possibly be. And so I've always made it a point from that point forward to try to write for people who feel like they don't have a representative voice in the genre.
I love that. I love that. I sometimes tell people, think of the person who most needs this book or whatever it is that you're working on. Write to that person. And it sounds like you have some clear ideas of who that is for you. And I love that you received that advice. Thinking, because this is the Writing and Resilience podcast, I always like to think about, how do you tap into your resilience? Because we all have it, but sometimes we forget. What do you do?
I think part of it for me is giving myself grace. And I go back to grace all the time, because I think as writers, and just as human beings in general, but as writers, I think we are very, very, very hard on ourselves. And we think that putting ourselves through the ringer is like a sign that we are strong and that we're resilient. This rejection, and you can take this, whatever it may be, and that this industry heaps upon you, and you have to do it because you're paying these dues. I'm like, no, you're still a human being. You have a certain skill set, but give yourself the grace to feel what you need to feel. If that rejection is making you cry, cry. If you're elated because amazing thing happened to you, don't feel ashamed to celebrate that. Like, let yourself feel like the full range of human emotions. And then that's your resilience, because you're going to tap into all those things as a writer. You need those highs and those lows in order to make it through this industry. And if you focus too much on the negative part, like all the small joys that come with getting that big thing, you miss all of those steps. I don't ever want to have a writer who feels like because they're not on the New York Times bestsellers list, or they don't have an agent, or they don't have a book dealer in advance, that the publication that you get from your dream pub is not as important. Like, so celebrate all of that stuff and give yourself the grace to understand that it's not always going to work out, but you're still here.
You are still here. And I think, yeah, I love what you said, because Brene Brown talks about how when you try to squash those negative feelings or focus too much on them, you also steal your joy. You have to have that full range of emotions to be able to write honestly and vulnerably. And honestly and vulnerably does not always mean writing about the sad stuff or feeling the sad stuff or the hard stuff. It's about all of it and giving yourself room for all of those things. Well, because you have a book out, this is going to also be in the show notes. Sometimes people have contracts where if people buy their book in a certain place, it's better off for them. So is there a best place to buy your book?
In this particular contract, not necessarily. It's the same percentage across the board. I would prefer, if you are going to buy the book, to buy it from like a local indie bookstore or a bookshop, because then you can just search by your local area and it'll give you the bookstore. But yeah, it doesn't change for me, but it changes for the people who are actually selling you the book, that profit should go to the smaller bookstores.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are writers, they're also the people who are going to let you in the doors to read your book one day and hopefully have it on their bookshelves.
Yes.
So where's the best place for people to look you up online?
You can find me mainly on Instagram under the username The Musepaper, but you can search by my first and last name. That's pretty much it. Because I'm on TikTok as well, but TikTok is just for videos. But if you want to like talk to me and see me and hear about writing and the process of writing, Instagram is the best place to find me.
Well, that will also be in the show notes. So in case you are forgetting that or you didn't catch it, you will be able to read it. And you need to check out Athena, connect with her, because she is amazing. I am deeply grateful to you for all the work that you do. And I cannot tell you the number of times when I'm working with clients and I'm mentioning your name. So I hope that there are days when you're like, my ears are burning. I wonder what that is. When you have that experience, it's me talking about how amazing you are. I'm also so grateful that you wrote this book, because it's a fantastic book. And again, I learned so much from it because of how you wrote it, but I also had that wonderful experience of not feeling as lonely in the world because of how you wrote this. And so thank you so much for being here today and for all you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing Your Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.